He didn't even look up from the table when he said it. "You're fired. Get off my land before sundown." The words landed like a slap across the smokehouse door, and every man in that yard heard them. They heard the way Gideon Mercer's brother Dale said it with his chest out, his boots planted wide, like he owned something that had never belonged to him. Mara Ellison stood there in the mud, her hands still smelling of hickory salt and wood smoke, 4 weeks of winter provisions behind her, and not one word of warning before this moment. She had saved this ranch. Every single person on that property knew it, and Dale Mercer had just driven up in a truck she'd never seen and decided, in about 30 seconds, that none of that mattered. If that were you, standing there with everything you'd built being ripped away by someone who never worked a single day of it, what would you do? Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because stories like this one don't come around twice, and we don't want you missing what happens next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Mara Ellison noticed about Blackstone Ranch was that it smelled like giving up. Not failure exactly. Failure had its own sharp, specific scent. This was something older and slower. The kind of smell that settles into wood beams and fence posts after years of good intentions running dry. She'd grown up around enough struggling homesteads to recognize it the moment she stepped out of Earl Budge's rust-colored pickup truck and felt the gravel shift under her boots. Earl had given her a ride from Harlow Junction, 40 minutes east, after she'd missed the last proper connection to anywhere else worth going. He'd asked her 3 times where she was headed. She told him she wasn't sure yet. He'd nodded like that was the most reasonable thing he'd ever heard and offered her a peppermint candy from his shirt pocket. She took the candy. She didn't take charity easily, but she took the candy. "Blackstone's that way," Earl had said, gesturing with one thick finger toward a dirt road that curved away from the main highway and disappeared behind a low ridge. "Gideon Mercer runs it. Quiet fella. Decent enough, I suppose. Been rough out there lately." Mara had asked, "How rough?" Earl just shook his head slowly. "The kind of rough where a man stops talking about the future." She'd thought about that the whole walk in. 1.5 miles on packed earth, her canvas bag over one shoulder. The October sky doing that particular Montana thing where it looks beautiful and merciless at exactly the same time, like it's reminding you it doesn't care which way things go for you. She wasn't running from anything. That was the part she needed people to understand, though she'd learned that most people didn't really want to understand it. They'd rather believe a young woman showing up alone to a struggling cattle ranch had something chasing her, a bad man, a broken family, some kind of wreckage behind her. Mara's wreckage was quieter than that. Her grandmother, Bess Ellison, had died in February. The small farmstead in southern Wyoming where Mara had learned everything she knew about curing meat, preserving food, managing cold season provisions, all of it had been sold to settle debts that her grandmother had never mentioned to anyone. By the time Mara understood the full shape of what was gone, there was nothing left to do but pick up the bag and move. She wasn't devastated by grief so much as untethered by it. Bess had been her anchor and her education simultaneously. Without her, Mara had skills that nobody around her seemed to need anymore, and no particular place to apply them. Until, apparently, this one. She saw the smokehouse before she saw the main house. It sat back from the yard at an angle, maybe 60 feet from a weathered equipment shed. Its timber gone gray and the iron chimney pipe listing slightly to one side. The door was padlocked. Weeds had grown knee-high along the base of its south wall. It had the look of something that had been given up on gradually, one season at a time, rather than all at once. Mara set her bag down in the gravel and stared at it for a moment. She was still staring when she heard boots on the porch behind her. "You lost?" The man's voice was flat. Not rude, just flat. The way a voice gets when someone has stopped expecting the world to offer them anything interesting. She turned around. Gideon Mercer was leaning against one of the porch posts with his arms crossed and a coffee mug in his right hand. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed. Lean in the way working men get lean. Not from effort, but from not having enough hours to eat properly. His jaw carried about 3 days of gray-shot stubble, and his eyes were the kind of dark brown that gave nothing away. "I heard you might be looking for help," Mara said. He looked at her the way you look at something unexpected that might still turn out to be trouble. Who told you that? Nobody specific. Word moves around. He turned his head slightly and looked out at the yard like he was considering whether he had time for this conversation. What kind of help? Provisions, cold storage, salting and smoking for winter stock. She paused, then added, Your smokehouse has been out of use for at least 2 seasons by the look of it. That got a reaction. Small, but there. Something shifted behind his eyes. You know smokehouse work? I know it better than most men twice my age. He looked back at her. The silence stretched out. A cold wind moved through the yard and rattled the equipment shed door. I can't pay much, he said finally. I know. Place is in rough shape. I can see that. He studied her for another long moment and then looked away again, jaw tight. Bunkhouse has an extra room, 3 meals a day if you help Rudy with breakfast, $25 a week. Mara had been offered worse. She'd also been offered better, which is maybe why the number stung a little, even though she didn't show it. $25 wouldn't matter much one way or the other if the work itself was solid. Fine, she said, but I need one thing. Gideon waited. The smokehouse is mine. Whatever happens in there, however I run it, whatever decisions I make, that's not up for committee. You don't second-guess me, your hands don't second-guess me. Nobody comes in there and tells me I'm doing it wrong. I work the way I work, or I don't work here at all. The words came out more forceful than she'd intended. She'd meant them to be steady and matter-of-fact. Instead, they landed with an edge to them, and she felt the yard go very quiet. In that particular way. It goes quiet when men suddenly pay attention to something a woman just said. Gideon Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his coffee mug on the porch rail, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a key on a rusted metal ring. He held it out. She walked over and took it. Neither of them said anything else. So, Rudy Coats ran the ranch kitchen out of habit and obligation more than passion. He was 63 years old, built like a man who had spent decades lifting things that were too heavy, and he talked to the cast-iron skillet when he thought nobody was listening. Mara liked him almost immediately, which surprised her, because she didn't usually like people quickly. He'd shown her to the extra bunkhouse room without ceremony and without small talk, dropped a spare wool blanket on the cot, and pointed out where the outhouse was, even though she'd already found it. Then he'd stood in the doorway for a moment. You really know smokehouse work? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly, the way old ranchmen nod when they're deciding whether to believe something. Gideon tried to get that thing running 2 winters ago. Hired a fella from up near Billings. Man spent 3 weeks in there and put up 40 pounds of meat that went bad before Christmas. Mara didn't say anything. Just telling you, Rudy said. He turned and left. She lay awake that first night listening to the wind work its way under the bunkhouse eaves. She'd heard the conversation in the yard before supper. Not the words exactly, but the tone. Ranch hands with that particular brand of skepticism that doesn't bother hiding itself. A couple of them had glanced at her across the supper table with expressions that said the same thing without requiring language. What does she think she's going to accomplish here? She'd eaten her food and not answered the question they hadn't asked. In the morning, she went to the smokehouse before breakfast. The padlock fought her. The door swung on hinges that groaned like they were angry about being disturbed. Inside, the air was close and cold and smelled of old ash and something slightly sour underneath it. The ghost of that 40 pounds of bad meat, maybe, still clinging to the walls. She stood in the dim interior for a while and let her eyes adjust. Her grandmother had done the same thing with every smokehouse she'd ever worked. Listen to it first, Bess always said. A smokehouse will tell you what it needs if you shut up long enough to hear it. Mara listened. The fire pit needed re-clearing. The old ash was packed down in a way that would choke airflow. The hanging rails were solid enough. Wrought iron, better than she'd expected. But someone had hung them too low, which was probably part of what had gone wrong 2 winters ago. The side ventilation gap on the east wall had been patched badly with the wrong material, blocking the slow draft she'd need for cold smoking. None of it was unfixable. All of it would take time she didn't quite have. She went back to the kitchen, ate breakfast standing up, and then came back and started working. By mid-morning, 3 of the ranch hands had drifted past the open smokehouse door. None of them came inside, but she could feel them watching. She was raking out the ash pit on her knees, her hair tied back, both forearms already gray with old char, when the first voice came through the door. "You planning to fix that with your bare hands?" She didn't look up. "Was going to ask Rudy if there's a proper ash rake somewhere on the property, unless you'd rather stand there asking questions." A pause. "South side of the equipment shed," the voice said, less confident than before. "Hanging on the left wall." "Thank you." Another pause. Then boots retreating on gravel. She found the rake exactly where he'd said. She went back to the pit and got to work. At noon, Gideon appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything, just looked at what she'd done so far. The cleared ash pit, the restrung hanging rails raised 6 inches higher than they'd been, the east wall vent opened back up with the bad patch material stripped away. She was measuring the gap with her hand, estimating what she'd need to seal it properly. "That vent was covered for a reason," he said. "What reason?" "Drafts. You need that draft. You shut it off, you lose your cold smoke draw. That's why your last batch went bad. Meat sat in stagnant air and heat it couldn't release." She turned and looked at him. "I'm going to need some materials. Green hickory if you've got any cut on the property. If not, I can work with applewood, but it'll change the flavor profile of the pork." He was quiet for a moment. "We've got hickory." "Good." He lingered another moment. "You're sure about the vent?" It wasn't quite a question. She held his gaze. "I'm sure about the vent." He left without another word. That afternoon, 2 of the hands dropped a cord of hickory beside the smokehouse door without being asked twice. The salt arrived on day 3. Mara had written out a list, not a shopping list exactly, more like a manifesto, her grandmother would have called it. Specific quantities, specific ratios, the reasoning behind each. Pink curing salt at precise measure, coarse kosher, brown sugar, black pepper, dried thyme, and a detail that made Rudy read the list twice before he handed it back to her. Juniper berries. "Juniper?" he said. "It's not as unusual as you think. Never seen it done in a smokehouse." "That doesn't mean it hasn't been done." He'd looked at her for a long moment, then folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. He came back the next morning with everything on it. He didn't explain how or where he'd found the juniper, and she didn't ask. The first batch of pork went in on a Thursday, 4 days after she'd arrived. She stayed up most of that first night. Not because she had to, but the fire was solid, the temperature was where she needed it, the draft was doing exactly what she'd told Gideon it would do. She stayed because she'd learned from Bess that the first night of the first batch tells you more about a smokehouse than any amount of inspection can. You have to be there. You have to smell the changes as they happen, feel the heat differential when you open the door, understand whether the smoke is carrying the way it should. She sat on an upturned crate just inside the doorway with her grandmother's worn notebook open on her knee. Bess had kept records going back 30 years. Temperature logs, humidity notes, wood combinations, curing times adjusted for elevation and season. The handwriting got smaller as the years went on, the margins fuller. Mara had memorized most of it, but she still liked having the notebook close. Around 2 in the morning, she heard boots on gravel. She looked up. Gideon was standing outside the smokehouse door in his coat, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He held one out. She took it. He didn't come inside. He leaned against the doorframe and looked in at the hanging meat, the slow curl of hickory smoke rising through the building in the way she'd set it up to move. "You do this your whole life?" he asked. "Since I was about 7, she said. "My grandmother taught me." He was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking about the answer, not just waiting to speak again. "She the one that figured out the juniper?" Mara looked down at the notebook. "That one was mine, actually. She hated it the first time I suggested it, said it was too strong." A pause. "She came around eventually." Gideon nodded slowly, both hands around his mug. The cold air sat between them, and neither of them tried to fill it with anything unnecessary. After a while, he straightened up. "Don't let the fire get lazy around 4. Temperature drops out here right before dawn." She'd already known that, but she looked at him and said, "Thank you." He walked back to the house. She stayed until sunrise, notebook in her lap, fire exactly where it needed to be. By morning, the smokehouse was breathing the way a good smokehouse breathes. Slow, deliberate, patient, like something that has remembered what it was made for. and Mara Ellison sat beside it in the cold October air and let herself feel, for the first time in months, like she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. The first ham came out of that smokehouse on a Sunday. Rudy sliced it at the kitchen counter while 3 ranch hands crowded the doorway pretending they weren't watching. He cut a thin piece, held it up to look at it in the light, the color of it, the way it held together, and then put it in his mouth. The kitchen went very quiet. "Well?" one of the men in the doorway finally said. Rudy didn't answer right away. He cut another piece, chewed it slowly, set the knife down on the counter. "Somebody go get Gideon," he said. The man in the doorway left at almost a trot. Mara stood at the far end of the counter and said nothing. She already knew what it tasted like. She'd known since 4 that morning. Gideon came in, still pulling on his jacket. Rudy handed him a slice without ceremony. Gideon ate it standing up, jaw working slowly, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked at Mara. She met his eyes and waited. "How long until the full batch is ready?" he asked. 10 more days for the shoulders and bellies. The ham's another week after that." He nodded once, turned and walked back out without another word. But she caught it, the brief thing that moved across his face before he turned. Not exactly relief, something closer to the moment before relief, when a man who has stopped expecting good things suddenly realizes he might have been wrong to stop. In the doorway, 2 ranch hands looked at each other. Neither of them said anything about the smokehouse anymore. Not that morning, anyway. The work continued, the weather moved closer, and somewhere inside that gray-timbered building that had smelled of giving up when Mara arrived, something entirely different was beginning to take hold. 10 days after the first ham came out of the smokehouse, Mara woke up at 5 in the morning to find someone had urinated on the hickory pile. She stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, looking at it for a moment. The smell was unmistakable. A good portion of the wood she'd stacked along the south wall of the smokehouse, wood she'd sorted by size and moisture content over 3 days, had been soaked through on one side. She crouched down and touched the bark. Still damp. It had happened in the last few hours. She didn't say anything at breakfast. She restacked what could be salvaged, dragged the ruined pieces away from the pile, and spent the better part of the morning splitting fresh wood from the cord Gideon had delivered the week before. Her shoulders ached by noon. She didn't stop. Rudy found her at the splitting block around 1 o'clock. He didn't ask what she was doing or why she looked like she hadn't stopped moving since dawn. He just picked up the second maul leaning against the smokehouse wall and started splitting alongside her without a word. They worked together for about 20 minutes before he said, "You know who did it? I've got a guess." "You going to say something to Gideon?" She swung the maul down and split around cleanly down the middle. "No." Rudy was quiet for a moment, breathing hard through his nose. He was 63 years old and not built for this kind of sustained work anymore, but he kept swinging. "That's either very smart or very stubborn," he said. "Probably both." He almost smiled at that. Almost. The man she suspected was a hand named Cleat Burroughs, late 30s, long face, the kind of slow-burn temper that doesn't flare up fast but holds heat a long time. He'd been at Blackstone 4 years, longer than any of the others, and he carried those years like seniority in a place that didn't officially give it. When Mara had first arrived and asked about the hickory supply, it had been Cleat who'd told her, with considerable authority, that the ranch had no green wood ready and that she'd have to make do with what was already cut. She'd gone looking herself 2 days later and found nearly a full cord of green hickory stacked behind the second pasture fence. She hadn't confronted him about it. She just had it moved. That had been, she suspected, the beginning of his particular hostility toward her. The next morning she found the smokehouse door latch had been bent. Not broken, but worked at until it sat crooked in the frame so that the door didn't close flush anymore. A half-inch gap along the bottom right edge, just enough to let in the wrong air and mess with her cold smoke draw if she didn't catch it. She caught it. She spent 40 minutes with a hammer and a piece of flat bar stock from the equipment shed, bending the latch back into alignment, the cold working her fingers until they were stiff and slow. She thought about going to Gideon. She thought about it seriously, sitting there in the cold with her stiff hands and the latch still slightly off square. And she decided against it. Not because she was afraid of what he'd do. She had a feeling Gideon would handle it directly and without ceremony. But because the moment she brought it to him, she became someone who needed protecting. and she hadn't come to Blackstone Ranch to be protected. She'd come to do a job. So she fixed the latch herself and said nothing. But the third incident was harder to absorb quietly. It happened on a Wednesday, 12 days into her second batch of curing. She'd been managing 3 distinct processes simultaneously: a slow, cold smoke on 2 pork bellies, a dry cure in progress on a set of shoulders she'd prepped the day before, and a brine solution she was reducing on a small outdoor fire for the next round of hams. She'd stepped away from the smokehouse for 20 minutes to check on the brine, and when she came back, the draft vent she'd reopened on the east wall had been stuffed with a rag. A burlap rag pushed in hard enough that it had been sitting there long enough to start warming from the smoke contact. She pulled it out with her bare hand and felt the heat in it, and stood there with her heart going fast in her chest. This wasn't a prank. A rag stuffed in the wrong place at the wrong time could ruin a batch, but it could also, if the timing was bad enough, create a situation inside the smokehouse that went beyond ruined meat. She'd seen it happen once, years ago, at a neighbor's property in Wyoming. Hot smoke with nowhere to go, building pressure in a confined space, hitting dried wood that had been seasoning too long. Her hands were shaking slightly when she went back inside to check the firebox and the hanging meat. Everything was okay. She'd caught it in time. She walked to the equipment shed, wrapped the rag around a fence post, and went back to work. That evening, after supper, she sat at the far end of the table and watched Cleat Burroughs eat his food and talked to the man beside him about something that had happened in town the previous weekend. He laughed at something, that specific laugh of a man who thinks he's gotten away with something. She ate her food. She said nothing. But something had shifted in her chest. Not toward anger exactly, more toward a kind of cold determination that felt more useful. She could absorb this. She could absorb it and keep working and finish what she'd come here to do, and when it was done, the smokehouse would speak louder than any of this ever could. She just had to make sure she lasted that long. What she hadn't counted on was Gideon already knowing. She found that out 10 days later, on a gray Friday afternoon when she came back from the smokehouse, to find him leaning in the equipment shed doorway, watching Cleat work on a tractor belt, with the careful, patient attention of a man who isn't actually interested in what he's watching. She went to the kitchen for water and didn't think much of it. But that evening, after the other hands had drifted off toward the bunkhouse, Gideon came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up and sat down at the table. "You know," he said, without any preamble, "if somebody's making your work harder than it needs to be, you can tell me." She wrung out the dishcloth and hung it on the rack. "I'm managing." "That's not what I asked." She turned around and looked at him. He was sitting with both forearms on the table, coffee mug pushed to one side, watching her with that flat, considering expression she'd come to understand was just his face when he was being honest. "The wood pile," he said, "and the door latch. Rudy told me about the wood pile." Of course Rudy had. She should have expected that. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the point." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Not because she was surrendering the argument, but because standing while he sat felt like the wrong geometry for this conversation. "If you go at him directly, it gets worse," she said. "It becomes about something other than the work. And the work is what matters right now." Gideon looked at her steadily. "You think I don't know how to handle my own crew? I think you're a fair man and you'll handle it the fair way, which means Cleat gets a warning and feels humiliated, and I spend the next month watching my back every time I'm in that smokehouse alone at night." Silence. "So what do you want me to do?" he said. Not quite a question. "Give it 2 more weeks," she said. "When the next batch comes out, the conversation changes. It already changed once. It'll change again. And when it does, a man like Cleat either comes around or he doesn't. But either way, the work is done and it doesn't matter." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his mug, stood up, and said, 2 weeks. He walked out. She sat at the table for another minute, staring at the grain of the wood, and felt the particular weariness of having to argue for the right to solve your own problems. The second full batch came out on a Saturday, 3 days after a cold front had moved down through the mountains and dropped the temperature in the valley to the low 20s overnight. Mara had been awake since 3, managing the fire through the cold snap, adjusting the air draw, checking the hang and the color of the meat at intervals. By the time the rest of the ranch came alive at 6:30, she'd already pulled the first set of bellies and the shoulders and had them laid out on the prep table inside. Rudy came in and stood looking at them for a long moment. "That's different than the first batch," he said. "Better or worse?" she asked, though she already knew. "Better." He paused, picking up one of the belly pieces and turning it over in his hands. "How?" Adjusted the brine timing on the cure. First batch was right, but the brine hadn't penetrated all the way through to the center on the thicker cuts. This time I extended it by 36 hours. Rudy set the piece down. "Where'd you learn to think like that?" "My grandmother kept 30 years of notes," she said, "and I paid attention." He nodded slowly. Then, and she noticed this, he didn't leave. He stood at the table and started helping her sort the cuts without being asked, his big weathered hands careful and precise around the meat. That morning at breakfast, one of the younger hands, a quiet kid named Tomas, who'd never once said anything hostile, just maintained the same cautious distance as the others, asked if he could see the smokehouse. Mara looked at him across the table. He was maybe 22, hat in his lap, clearly a little embarrassed to be asking. "After breakfast," she said. He came by around 9. She showed him the fire arrangement, the hanging rail height, the east vent, the way the draft moved smoke through the space. He asked good questions, the kind that came from actual curiosity, not from trying to find holes in what she was doing. She answered all of them. When he left, he said, "That's something," with the particular tone of a young person who has encountered something they didn't expect to respect. She watched him walk back across the yard and thought about how simple it actually was, the way people came around. Not speeches, not confrontations. Just the work, speaking for itself, long enough and loudly enough. Cleat Burroughs, for the record, did not come to see the smokehouse that morning. He spent the day working fence line on the north pasture and came back at supper without looking at her. She didn't require anything more from him than that. The conversation that changed things really changed them, not in the small ways they'd been shifting since her first batch. Happened not on the ranch at all, but in town. Gideon had driven into Carver's Crossing on a Tuesday for supplies. Mara had gone with him, not because she'd been invited exactly, but because she needed pickling spice and a particular weight of twine she couldn't source from the ranch's own supplies. They'd driven in mostly in silence, which by now was not uncomfortable. It was just how Gideon occupied space. She'd stopped trying to fill his silences 2 weeks ago. He'd dropped her at the general store and gone on to the hardware supplier. She was working through the spice section when she heard her name, not her full name, just that woman from the Mercer place, which in Carver's Crossing apparently functioned as her name. 2 women standing near the dry goods. One of them, mid-50s, in a good coat, not looking at Mara, but definitely talking about her. From what Frank said, Gideon hired some girl to run the smokehouse. Can you imagine? Place is barely holding together as it is. The second woman made a sound of sympathetic skepticism. Frank says the hands think she's going to get them all killed in a smokehouse fire or poison the whole winter supply. A pause. I mean, who does that? Who walks into a failing ranch and says, "Give me the smokehouse"? What kind of woman does that? Mara picked up her pickling spice. She turned it over in her hands, checking the label. "Probably just looking for somewhere to stay the winter," the first woman said. "You know how it is?" Mara set the spice in her basket and walked to the counter. She paid for her things. She walked outside and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the cold air and looked at the street. A dog was sleeping in a patch of thin October sun near the post office. A truck rolled through the intersection and kept going. She breathed in and out a few times and waited for the feeling in her chest to settle. She wasn't naive about any of it, not about how she was seen, not about the particular way the world looked at a young woman who walked into a man's failing operation and asked for authority. She'd understood that from the first morning in the smokehouse. Understanding it and feeling it hit you from a stranger's mouth in a general store were 2 different things, though. Gideon pulled up in the truck 10 minutes later. She climbed in. They drove back toward the ranch, and she looked out the window at the low brown hills and said nothing. About halfway home, without turning to look at her, he said, "You all right?" She glanced at him. "Fine." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't look fine." "I ran into some local opinion in the general store." He didn't ask for details.
He just nodded, slow and deliberate, like he'd already had his own version of the same experience. Small towns, he said. Yeah. He turned onto the ranch road, gravel crackling under the tires. After another minute, he said, "For what it's worth. Nobody at that ranch doubts the smokehouse anymore." She looked at him. "They might not say it," he added, "but nobody doubts it." She looked back out the window. The ridge above the ranch caught the last angle of afternoon light, and for just a moment the whole landscape looked golden and enormous and indifferent in the way beautiful things often are. "That's what I'm there for," she said. "I know." He paused. "Doesn't mean I can't say it." She didn't answer that, but something in her chest loosened just a fraction. The specific tension of a person who has been carrying something alone for long enough that they've forgotten what it felt like not to. The third week brought the first real freeze. Not the cold snap from earlier, that had been brisk, uncomfortable, a preview. This was the serious kind, the kind that moved in overnight without much warning and sat on the valley like a hand pressing down. Mara woke at 2 a.m. with the feeling that something was wrong before she could identify what. She lay still for 3 seconds, listening. The wind had changed. That was it. The sound of it was different, sharper, without the low moan it had been making since sundown. She got up, pulled on her coat and boots over her long underwear, and went out. The thermometer outside the bunkhouse read 11 degrees. She said a single, very specific word under her breath and moved fast toward the smokehouse. The fire was still going. She'd built it right before bed, good hardwood base that would hold, but 11 degrees was a different problem than 28 degrees, which was where it had been sitting when she'd gone to sleep. At 11, the temperature differential inside the smokehouse versus outside shifted in ways that affected the smoke behavior, the surface temperature of the hanging meat, and the rate at which certain chemical processes in the cure either progressed or stalled. She rebuilt the firebox arrangement in the dark by feel and firelight, working steadily, her breath coming in hard white clouds. She adjusted the east vent, opened it slightly more than she normally would have, compensating for the change in external pressure that came with a hard freeze. She checked every piece of hanging meat with her hands, moving along the rails in the dark, feeling for the surface temperature and texture she'd memorized from years of doing this. One of the shoulder cuts had started to stiffen at the surface more than she wanted. She moved it to a different position on the rail, further from the direct smoke channel, where the ambient warmth would reach it more evenly. She sat down on her upturned crate and waited. At some point, she thought it was around 4, though she'd lost track. The smokehouse door opened and Rudy was there with a thermos of coffee. He didn't say anything, just poured a cup and handed it to her and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. "How bad?" he asked. "Manageable," she said. "I caught it in time." "The shoulders?" "One of them needed repositioning. It's okay now." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The fire cracked and settled. "My wife used to do this," Rudy said eventually, not looking at her, just looking at the fire. "Smokehouse work. Not as good as you, but she knew what she was doing." He was quiet for a moment. "She died 7 years ago." Mara didn't say anything. She understood that some things weren't said because they needed a response. "She would have liked you," he added. "She didn't have a lot of patience for people who did things halfway." The fire popped. A piece of hickory shifted in the box. "That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in a while," Mara said. Rudy almost smiled. He finished his coffee, pushed himself up off the floor with considerable effort and some difficulty with his left knee and said, "I'll have breakfast ready at 6. Come in when you're done." He left. She stayed. By the time the sky started going from black to dark blue, she'd checked every piece of meat on every rail twice. The fire was exactly where it needed to be. The vent was doing what she'd asked it to do. The temperature inside had stabilized at a range she could work with. At 6:15, she walked into the kitchen with smoke in her hair and her coat, hands red from the cold, and sat down at the table while Rudy put eggs and salt pork in front of her. Tomas was at the table along with 2 of the other hands. They looked at her when she came in and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tomas said, "How's it look?" "Good," she said. "We didn't lose anything." He nodded and went back to his food, and that was all. But it wasn't nothing. It was the opposite of nothing, actually.
It was the specific small thing that a person notices when they've been working among strangers and suddenly, without any ceremony or announcement, they're not working among strangers anymore. She ate her eggs. The salt pork on her plate was from the first batch, hers, from the smokehouse, with the juniper brine and the hickory smoke and 36 hours of cure. She ate it without thinking about it, because she'd been eating from that batch for 3 weeks, and it was just food now. Except that morning, sitting in that kitchen with the cold outside and the fire still going in the smokehouse, and every piece of winter provision accounted for, it tasted like something more than food. It tasted like the specific satisfaction of doing something right when it mattered and having it hold. She didn't say any of that. She finished her breakfast, pushed back her chair, and went back to work. Cleat Burroughs came to the smokehouse on a Thursday, 4 weeks and 2 days after Mara had arrived at Blackstone Ranch. He came alone, in the mid-afternoon, when most of the other hands were out on the property, and Mara was inside doing a final check on the third batch before she started on the pre-cure for the next round. She heard his boots on the gravel and looked up. He stood in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, not in a polite way, more in the way of a man who's picked something up and doesn't quite know what to do with it. He looked around the smokehouse interior with the expression of someone who has heard a lot about a place and is seeing it properly for the first time. She waited. "That smell," he said finally, and stopped. "The juniper," she said. "It hits stronger in here than it does in the taste." He nodded, looked at the hanging meat, looked at the fire setup. His jaw moved like he was working something around. "My father used to smoke his own hogs," he said. "Never came out right. He blamed the wood, the weather, everything but what he was actually doing wrong." She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned to leave space in conversations with men like Cleat, who came to things sideways and needed the room. "Anyway," he said. He put his hat back on. "Looks like you know what you're doing." He turned and walked out. That was it. That was all of it. She stood in the middle of the smokehouse for a moment after he left, hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her once that the hardest apologies to receive were the ones that people couldn't quite say out loud, because those were the ones that cost them the most to give. She picked up her notebook, found her place on the page, and went back to work. Outside, the smoke rose from the chimney in a slow, steady column, visible for a mile in any direction. The valley was going brown and gold with the last of October. The mountains to the north had already taken their first real snow, white and permanent looking against the blue sky. Blackstone Ranch was not saved yet. Not entirely. There was still a full month of work ahead of her, still more curing and smoking and salting than she'd accomplished so far. Still the deep winter provisions that would determine whether this place came through the cold season with enough to sustain itself or whether it came out the other side hungry and hollowed. But standing in that smokehouse with the fire right and the meat right, and the smoke doing exactly what she'd told Gideon it would do, she felt the shape of what was possible here. She could see it clearly, the way you can sometimes see the end of a long piece of work before you finished it. Not as certainty, but as something just slightly more solid than hope. She turned back to the fire and added another piece of hickory, slow and deliberate, the way her grandmother had taught her. She had work to do. She did it. The news from town arrived the way bad news usually does at a ranch, sideways through someone who wasn't supposed to be the one telling it. It was Tomas who came back from a supply run on a Friday afternoon with the particular look of a young man carrying something heavier than groceries. He set the bags on the kitchen counter, didn't make eye contact with Rudy, and then made the mistake of glancing toward the smokehouse window just as Mara was coming in from outside. She read his face immediately. What happened? He pulled his hat off. There's talk in town. There's always talk in town. Different kind. He set his hat on the counter, looked at it. Harlan Briggs was at the feed store when I came through. He was telling some men, 5 of them, standing right there in the aisle, that Gideon Mercer had lost his mind, that he'd handed his winter provisions over to some drifter girl, and the whole ranch was going to come up short before January. Rudy, who had been pretending to be occupied with the stove, stopped pretending. He said Gideon used to be a serious man, Tomas continued, still looking at his hat, and now he was letting a woman run his smokehouse like it was some kind of... He stopped. His word was experiment. Mara said nothing for a moment. Harlan Briggs was a name she'd heard twice before, once from Rudy, who'd mentioned him as the owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley, and once from Gideon himself, who'd said his name with the particular flatness of a man who has made peace with not liking someone. The Briggs Ranch was 3 times the size of Blackstone. It ran properly, profitably, with hired hands and equipment and a smokehouse operation that had been producing commercial-grade product for over a decade. And Harlan Briggs had, according to Rudy, made 2 separate offers to buy Blackstone in the last 3 years. Both times, Gideon had said no. "How many people were listening?" she asked. "Enough," Tomas said, and he wasn't quiet about it. She nodded slowly. "Did anyone push back?" Thomas hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying the word. She looked at Rudy. "Briggs has history here," Rudy said carefully. "I know." She picked up her notebook from the counter where she'd left it and tucked it under her arm. "I need to check the fire." She went back to the smokehouse. She stood inside it for a few minutes in the warm, smoke-thick air and let the information settle into her like the cold had settled into the valley. Not all at once, but gradually, finding every crack and corner. She wasn't surprised. She'd understood from the first week that there was a version of this where it stopped being about the smokehouse and started being about something larger. Gideon's position in the valley, his stubbornness in the face of Briggs's offers, his decision to hire her, all of it was material for someone who wanted to paint him as a man losing his grip. And a young woman in a smokehouse was, she knew, an extremely convenient symbol for exactly that kind of argument. The question was what Gideon would do when it reached him. She found out the next morning. He came into the kitchen early, before Rudy had started breakfast, and poured himself coffee and sat down. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not angry exactly, but the way a man's jaw sets when he's decided something and is in the process of making sure it holds. He looked at her across the table. "You heard about Briggs. Tomas told me yesterday. What do you think?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I think he's using me to say what he actually means about you, which is that you're struggling and you made a desperate choice and you're too proud to take the offer he's been making." Gideon looked at his coffee. "That's about right." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going into town Saturday," he said. "There's a community thing at the Grange Hall. Winter planning meeting happens every year. Briggs will be there. Half the valley will be there." He looked up at her. "I'm going to talk about what's happening at this ranch, the honest version, not to argue with him, just to say it plainly, out in the open, in front of people who matter." She held his gaze. "You don't need to defend me." "I know I don't," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." She thought about that. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the mug in his hands. "Because what Briggs is doing is the same thing he does every time. He waits until somebody's struggling, and then he makes that struggle look like stupidity, so that by the time he makes his offer, it looks like the only reasonable option." He set the mug down. "I'm not selling this ranch. I'm not going to let him build the story that makes it look like I should." She understood then that this wasn't about her at all, not at its core. It was about 2 men in a valley and a long argument over what a piece of land was worth to the person who'd put their life into it. She was just the point Briggs had chosen to press on. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, like it was a confirmation. He picked up his mug and left the kitchen, and she listened to his boots on the porch steps and thought that whatever happened in that Grange Hall, it was going to change the shape of things one way or another. And Saturday came in with low clouds and the smell of coming snow. Gideon drove to Carver's Crossing alone. He hadn't asked her to come, and she hadn't offered. Her place was in the smokehouse, and they both knew it. She had a fresh batch of bellies going into brine that afternoon, and the timing on the 4th batch of shoulders was too tight to leave unattended. She worked through the morning, checked the brine, repositioned 2 cuts on the lower rail where the smoke density was slightly heavier than she wanted. Around noon, Rudy brought her a sandwich and coffee and stood in the doorway. "You worried about today?" he asked. "A little." "Gideon can handle himself." "I know he can." She took a bite of the sandwich. "That's not what worries me." Rudy waited. What worries me is that it doesn't matter how well he handles himself, if enough people have already decided what the story is. She chewed, swallowed. A man defending a decision to a room full of people who think the decision was wrong, that's just a harder version of the same conversation I've been having in this smokehouse for 5 weeks. Rudy was quiet for a moment. What did you do in the smokehouse? Worked, she said. He nodded slowly. Well, he'll do the same. She wanted to believe that was sufficient. She mostly did believe it. She went back to the fire and the brine and the careful, patient arithmetic of winter provisions, and she tried not to think about what was happening 40 minutes down the valley road. She found out when Gideon came back at 4:30. She heard the truck on the gravel from inside the smokehouse and waited. She heard him stop in the yard, heard his door, heard him say something brief to one of the hands she couldn't make out through the smokehouse wall. Then boots on gravel, coming her way. He opened the smokehouse door and leaned in the frame the way he'd started doing, not coming all the way in unless she invited it, which was a habit she'd noticed about 3 weeks in and appreciated without ever saying so. He looked tired. Not defeated, but the specific tiredness of a man who has spent several hours being civil to people he doesn't particularly respect. How'd it go? She asked. He took a breath. Briggs said his piece, I said mine. A pause. I told them what you'd done here. The batches, the quantities, the method. Told them the smokehouse had been dead for 2 seasons before you came, and it was running properly inside a week. He looked at the hanging meat, then back at her. I said I hired you on your terms because you knew what you were doing, and I was smart enough to recognize it. She waited. Briggs said it was a temporary fix, and I was ignoring the larger problems with the operation. He shifted slightly in the doorframe. A few people agreed with him. A few people didn't. And I said that any ranch still standing at the end of winter was a ranch that had made its right choices. He paused. Then Margaret Forsyth, she's got the sheep operation up near the North Pass. She said she'd heard the smokehouse at Blackstone was putting up better product than anything she'd seen from a small ranch in 10 years, and maybe Briggs should worry less about how Gideon Mercer ran his own land. Something in Mara's chest shifted. I don't know Margaret Forsyth. She doesn't know you either, Gideon said, but word gets around. Apparently her hired man's brother is Tomas. Mara almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. Gideon's expression didn't exactly warm, but something around the edges of it did. Briggs didn't say much after that. Meeting moved on. She turned back to the fire, added a piece of hickory, watched the smoke change. Thank you, she said, for what you said in there. I said what was true. I know, that's why I'm thanking you. A long pause. Third batch ready to pull tomorrow? He asked. Day after, she said. The bellies need the full time. He nodded. Good. He pushed off the doorframe and left. She stayed with the fire until the light outside went gray and then dark, and she thought about Margaret Forsyth, a woman she'd never met, defending her work in a room full of strangers. She thought about how the strangest kindnesses were the ones that came from people with no particular reason to offer them. She put another piece of hickory on the fire. She thought, hold on a little longer. The freeze that came the following Wednesday was not the 11-degree snap from 3 weeks earlier. This one was different in character. Not a sharp drop, but a sustained, pressing cold that settled over the valley like it had no intention of leaving. The temperature at noon on Wednesday was 4 degrees. By Wednesday night, it was below 0. Mara had been watching the sky since Monday. Something in the light had changed, a particular flatness, a heaviness in the cloud cover that her grandmother had taught her to read as a sign of cold that was committing rather than visiting. She'd started her preparations Tuesday evening without telling anyone why. She cut her wood supply into smaller pieces than usual for more controlled burning. She reinforced the east vent seal on the outside with a strip of raw hide she'd asked Rudy to find her, which allowed the vent to function properly without losing the marginal heat she'd need through the coldest hours. She checked every cure rack and every hanging piece with more attention than usual, looking for any variation that might become a problem under sustained extreme cold. She moved her cot into the smokehouse on Tuesday night. Just the cot, her blanket, her grandmother's notebook, and her coat. She set it along the south wall where the ambient warmth from the fire pit was steadiest, and where she'd be close enough to the firebox to wake up if the temperature inside shifted meaningfully. Rudy found the empty bunkhouse room on Wednesday morning and came to the smokehouse door. He looked at the cot. He looked at her. "You're staying in here," he said. "Through the freeze, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Until it breaks. 2, 3 days, probably." He looked at the cot again like it offended him personally. "That's not... You can't sleep in a smokehouse." "People have done it for centuries." "Mara." She looked at him. "Rudy, I have 4 complete batches of provisions hanging in this building. That's most of the ranch's winter food supply. If the fire goes out overnight at these temperatures, I lose heat differential, the surface chemistry on the cure stalls, and I could lose consistency across every piece in here. It's not dramatic. It's just math." She paused. "I'm sleeping in here." He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking unhappy. "I'll bring you supper." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, and left. He brought supper. He also brought an extra wool blanket without mentioning it, just set it on the end of the cot and turned around and said he'd have coffee ready at 5:30. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check the fire and the temperature differential and the behavior of the smoke. At some point in the early hours of Thursday morning, she thought it was around 3. She woke to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. She lay still, listening. It was the wind, but changed. Higher pitched, harder. She got up and opened the smokehouse door, and the cold hit her like something physical, a solid wall of it, the air so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. The thermometer outside read -14. She said something her grandmother would have disapproved of and closed the door and got to work. The fire had dropped during the 2 hours she'd slept. Not dangerously, but enough. She rebuilt it with precise attention, adding the right size pieces in the right sequence, coaxing the temperature back up with the patience of someone who has done this enough times to know that panic serves nobody in a smokehouse. She adjusted the vent for the new external temperature, opening it slightly more than intuition said to, trusting the math rather than the feeling. She checked every piece of hanging meat in the firelight, moving along the rails slowly, hands reading each surface, looking for any sign of temperature damage. The specific stiffening, the color change, the texture shift that told you something had gotten too cold for too long. She found 2 belly pieces on the north rail that had gone slightly cooler than she wanted. She moved them to the center rail, where they'd get more even heat distribution. Then she went back to the fire and sat. She was not afraid exactly, but she was very aware of the weight of what was happening around her. The brutal cold pressing against the walls of the smokehouse, the complete darkness outside, the sound of the wind finding every small gap in the structure. She was one person, in the dark, in -14 degrees, keeping a fire going that represented months of work and the survival of a ranch she'd known for less than 2 months. She thought about her grandmother, not the Bess who existed in memory as advice and warmth, but the actual physical Bess, the woman who used to sit beside a smokehouse fire at 3 in the morning with her notebook and her thermos of coffee, saying very little, watching the smoke the way other people watched water. "The fire doesn't care if you're tired," Bess used to say, with no particular emotion. "So you keep going." Mara kept going. At 5:15, before the sky had moved even slightly toward light, the smokehouse door opened and Gideon came in. He was in his heavy coat and his hat, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He looked around the interior, the cot, the notebook, the rebuilt fire, the hanging meat. And then he looked at her, sitting on her upturned crate, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He handed her a mug. She took it. He sat down on the floor, back against the south wall, the same spot Rudy had sat weeks ago during the first freeze. He looked at the fire. "How is it?" he asked. "Holding," she said. "I lost some heat on the north rail around 3. Moved the pieces. It should be okay." "Should be?" "Will be," she said. "It'll be okay." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind made its hard, high sound against the walls. After a few minutes, he said, "You didn't have to stay in here." "Yes, I did." He looked at her. She met his eyes. He looked back at the fire. "I know," he said quietly. They sat in the smokehouse through the last dark hours of that brutal night without talking much, and what was said was practical. Fire, temperature, the provisions, the timing on the next day's check. But the sitting itself was a different kind of conversation, the kind that doesn't require words and maybe can't use them. The sky went from black to dark gray to the particular cold, pale blue of a Montana dawn after a hard freeze, and when Mara opened the smokehouse door and stepped out to check the thermometer, it read -9. Still brutal, but it had stopped dropping. She went back inside. Temperature stabilizing, Gideon had stood up and was standing near the fire, warming his hands. He looked at her over his shoulder. "You should sleep. I'll check the north rail first." She went along the rail, hands reading each piece in the growing light from the open door. All of it held. The 2 belly pieces she'd moved at 3 in the morning were exactly where they should be. Temperature, surface texture, color. She stood at the end of the rail with her hands at her sides and felt something large and quiet move through her chest. She'd done it. The provisions were intact, all of it. Every piece of cured meat, every belly and shoulder and ham, every hour of work she'd put into that building since the first morning she'd raked the ash pit on her knees, all of it had come through the worst night of the season without a single loss. She didn't say this out loud. She just stood there for a moment and let it be true inside her before the world could start having opinions about it. Gideon was watching her from across the smokehouse. "Well," he said. "We didn't lose anything," she said. He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded. Just once, short, the way he did when something mattered more than he wanted to show, and turned and picked up his mug. She went to her cot, pulled the extra wool blanket around her, and was asleep within 3 minutes. She woke at noon to sunlight coming through the smokehouse vents and the sound of voices in the yard. She lay still for a moment, listening, trying to place what she was hearing. More voices than usual, a truck engine she didn't recognize, and then another. She sat up and looked out the narrow gap between the door and the frame and saw vehicles in the yard she hadn't seen before. A truck with a Forsyth Sheep Company logo on the door, a dark green pickup she didn't recognize, a third vehicle partially out of her sightline. She put on her coat and boots and opened the smokehouse door. There were 6 people in the yard she'd never seen before. 2 women, 4 men, all in heavy coats, talking to Rudy and 2 of the hands. Gideon was standing with a man about his age who had the look of someone who managed large amounts of land, the particular posture of a person accustomed to thinking about acres rather than feet. Rudy saw her come out of the smokehouse, and his face did something complicated. Gideon turned. "This is the woman I told you about," he said, to no one and everyone. "Mara Ellison." One of the women, Margaret Forsyth, Mara realized, putting the name together with a tall, direct-eyed woman in a sheepskin coat, walked toward her with her hand out. "I've been wanting to meet you since the Grange meeting," she said. "I'm Margaret. I run the sheep operation up by the North Pass." Mara shook her hand. "I know who you are." Margaret's mouth curved. "Good. I came to see the smokehouse." She paused. "And to ask a question, if you're willing." "What question?" "Whether you'd be willing to look at my operation this spring and tell me what you think." She said it plainly, without apology. "I've been putting up provisions the same way for 15 years, and I suspect I've been doing at least 2 things wrong the whole time." Mara stood in the yard in her smoke-smelling coat, blinking in the noon sunlight, and looked at this woman she'd never met, who had stood up for her in a room full of strangers and was now standing in Gideon Mercer's yard asking for her help. "I can do that," she said. Margaret nodded like the matter was settled, which apparently it was. She looked past Mara at the smokehouse. "Can I look inside?" Mara stepped aside and held the door open. She stood in the yard while Margaret Forsyth walked into the smokehouse alone. She could hear the woman moving inside, the deliberate footsteps of someone looking at something carefully. After a few minutes, she heard a single low sound. Not exactly words, more like the involuntary noise a person makes when they see something that exceeds their expectation. Then the other visitors were moving toward the smokehouse, and Rudy was beside her with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was pleased but didn't want to look pleased. "You're going to need to give a lot of tours," he said quietly. "I don't give tours," she said. "You're going to start."
The man Gideon had been talking to was beside them now. He introduced himself as Pete Gallagher from a cattle operation 2 valleys east. He looked at her with the frank, assessing look of someone who deals in practical things. "I heard you kept a fire through -14 last night." "I did," she said. "Alone?" She thought about Gideon's coffee at 5 in the morning, the 2 mugs, the silence beside the fire, the hour they'd sat together while the cold pressed against the walls.
She thought about what that meant and what it didn't mean and what the right answer was. "Yes," she said. Pete Gallagher nodded slowly, looking at her the way Earl Budge had nodded at her in the truck on the way in, like something that was actually reasonable turning out to also be remarkable. She stood in the yard in the cold noon sunlight and let the morning settle around her. The smokehouse stood open, people moving in and out of it with the careful attention of people encountering something they hadn't expected to take seriously. Rudy was making coffee in the kitchen. Tomas was talking to one of the Forsyth ranch hands near the equipment shed, easy and relaxed, the posture of a young man who started feeling good about where he works. Gideon stood 20 feet away talking to Pete Gallagher with his coffee mug, and for just a moment he caught her eye across the yard. He didn't nod, didn't gesture. Just a brief look, direct and uncomplicated, the look of a man acknowledging something that happened between them in the dark and the cold and the early morning. She looked back at him for exactly that moment, and then looked away. She had provisions to check. The fire had been running unattended for 5 hours, which was within the margin she'd built in, but only barely. She excused herself from the yard with no particular ceremony and went back into the smokehouse, closing the door behind her. Inside, the fire was right. The smoke was right. The hanging meat was right. She stood alone in this warm, quiet interior and felt the noise of the yard fall away, and she let herself have it, fully, privately, without minimizing it, the knowledge that she had come to a failing ranch in October with a bag and a notebook, and it was now November and every single provision she had promised this place was accounted for, intact, and more than enough to carry Blackstone Ranch through the hardest part of winter. She let herself have it for about 30 seconds. Then she opened her notebook to the next page, picked up her pencil, and started planning the next batch. The visitors left by mid-afternoon, and the yard went quiet again in the way ranch yards go quiet after unexpected company. Not the usual quiet, but something slightly different, a little charged, like the air after a bell has stopped ringing, but the sound is still somewhere in the walls. Mara came out of the smokehouse at 3 to find Rudy stacking the extra coffee mugs on a tray with the methodical care of a man processing his thoughts through his hands. She picked up 2 mugs from the porch rail and handed them to him. "Margaret Forsyth," she said. "What do you know about her?" Rudy set the mugs on the tray. "Ran the sheep operation alone for 6 years after her husband died. Expanded it twice. Turned down a partnership offer from Briggs in year 3. He paused. "Woman knows what she's doing and doesn't particularly care who knows it." Mara thought about that. "And Pete Gallagher?" "Good man. Fair. His operation 2 valleys east has been profitable 10 out of the last 12 years. He doesn't come to other people's ranches unless he thinks there's a reason." Rudy picked up the tray. Him being here today was not nothing. She understood what he was telling her. She looked out at the yard, the tire tracks from the unfamiliar trucks still visible in the frost-hardened ground. 3 hours ago, this yard had held strangers who had driven out of their way to see a smokehouse. 6 weeks ago, this smokehouse had been padlocked and weed-grown and smelling of failure. She went back inside and worked until dark, and she didn't let herself think too hard about what that meant. What changed in the days that followed was subtle enough that she almost missed it, and then suddenly obvious enough that she couldn't miss it at all. It started with Cleat. Not a dramatic change. Nothing about Cleat Burroughs was dramatic, at least not in any direction that involved admitting things. But on the Thursday after the visitors came, she asked him at breakfast if he knew whether the secondary fence line on the north pasture had any gaps in the windbreak, because she was thinking about moving some of the green hickory to a sheltered position before the next cold front. He told her, directly, accurately, with a specificity that said he'd actually thought about the answer, that there was a solid break along the eastern section that would work well, and that he could have one of the younger hands clear the access path if she needed it. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to his eggs. That was it. But that was everything, in its way. Tomas started stopping by the smokehouse in the late afternoons without any pretense. Not asking to learn, not asking for anything really, just present. He'd lean in the doorway or sit on the upturned crate while she worked. And after a few visits, they'd started talking the way people talk when they've given up on being formal about it. He was from New Mexico originally, he told her. Came up to Montana after a bad year on his family's property, figured he'd work a season and go back. That had been 3 years ago. You ever think about going back? She asked him once. He was quiet for a moment. I think about it, but I think about it less than I used to. She understood that. She understood it probably more than she'd have admitted at the time. Even the dynamic at the supper table had shifted. Not loudly, not with any announcement. Just the gradual movement of people who have stopped performing their skepticism because the performance has become too much work. The table was easier now. Conversations crossed the full length of it without the previous invisible fault lines. She was no longer eating at one end while the hands talked among themselves at the other. She was just eating supper. She noticed all of this without saying anything about it to anyone, and she tried very hard not to feel too much about it, because she'd learned that the feeling was the dangerous part. The part that made you start believing you belonged somewhere before you'd confirmed it was true. So, Gideon's brother showed up on a Monday. She didn't know he had a brother. That was the first thing she registered. The truck pulling into the yard, unfamiliar again, and then Gideon going very still on the porch in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was rest. This was the kind that came before something difficult. The man who got out of the truck was taller than Gideon, broader, with the same dark eyes, but arranged in a face that wore them differently. Open where Gideon's were guarded, loud where Gideon's were quiet, the kind of man who fills a yard just by standing in it. He had his arms out before he was fully clear of the truck. "Gid," he said, with the warmth of someone returning from a long absence. Gideon walked off the porch and they embraced briefly and without much ceremony, the way men who love each other but live very differently manage these things. Mara watched from the smokehouse doorway. She wasn't trying to watch. She'd come out to check the thermometer and simply hadn't gone back in. The brother, she'd learned his name was Dale Mercer, who lived in Billings now and worked in something to do with commercial real estate, swept his eyes around the yard with the particular assessment of a man who has an opinion forming faster than he's been given information to form it with. His eyes landed on the smokehouse, then on her. He said something to Gideon she couldn't hear from this distance. Gideon glanced toward her briefly. Then he said something back and put his hand on his brother's shoulder in the way you redirect someone's attention, and they went inside. She went back to her fire. That evening at supper, Dale sat at the far end of the table with Gideon and talked loudly about several things that had nothing to do with the ranch. He was the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller, not unpleasantly, necessarily, just comprehensively. He told a story about a property deal in Billings that Mara didn't follow and didn't try to. He ate well and complimented the food with the slightly excessive warmth of a person who's aware that complimenting food is the easiest available social grace. He looked at her twice during supper. She held his gaze both times without making anything of it, and he looked away both times without incident. After supper, she was washing her dish at the kitchen basin when she heard him come in behind her. She didn't turn around. "You're the smokehouse woman," he said. "Mara Ellison," she said. "Dale Mercer." He came around to lean against the counter to her left so she'd have to turn to face him or continue talking to the basin. She dried her hands and turned. He was looking at her with a kind of frank inventory that wasn't quite rude, but wasn't comfortable either. "Gideon tells me you've been running the provisions operation." "Since October." "And it's going well?" "It's going well." He nodded slowly, processing. There was something working behind his eyes that she didn't immediately understand. Not hostility, that she would have recognized. Something more deliberate. "How long are you planning to stay?" She looked at him. "Through the season." "And after?" "I haven't thought much past the season." He nodded again, looked away, looked back. "Gideon's a proud man," he said, with the tone of someone offering information they believe is useful. "He doesn't ask for help easily, and he doesn't talk about his problems directly. I'm guessing you've figured that out." "I have." "This ranch has been in trouble longer than the smokehouse." He said it without cruelty, but without softening it. The provisions are important, but they're not the whole picture. She waited. She had a feeling there was more, and she was right. There's been an offer on the table, he said, from Harlan Briggs. Fair price, honestly. Maybe even generous, given the current state of the operation. Gideon won't hear it. He won't even discuss it. He paused. I worry about him. The kitchen was quiet. She could hear the fire settling in the stove. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Dale looked at her steadily. Because you've got more influence over what happens in this yard in the next 2 months than you might realize, and I'd hate for that influence to be pointed in the wrong direction. She held his gaze for a long moment. What direction do you think I'm pointing it? He spread his hand slightly. I think you believe you're saving this ranch. I think maybe you are, in one specific way. But I think there are a lot of people who have believed they were saving this ranch over the years, and the ranch is still in the shape it's in. She put the dish down on the rack and looked at him directly. Your brother hired me to run the smokehouse. I ran it. The winter provisions are in better shape right now than they've been in at least 2 seasons, by Rudy's account. That's what I know. The rest of it, she paused, is not my business, and it's not yours to use me to manage. Something shifted in Dale's expression. Not offense, more like recalibration. Like a man who is accustomed to conversations going a certain way and has encountered a version that isn't cooperating. Fair enough, he said, after a moment. He pushed off the counter and walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to his boots on the porch. She breathed carefully and slowly and thought about what he'd said. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that some part of it had landed. Not the implication about her influence, which she resented, but the underneath of it. The ranch in trouble longer than the smokehouse. Gideon, who doesn't talk about his problems directly. A price that was maybe even generous. She already knew all of that, in the way you know things you haven't examined directly. Hearing it said out loud by someone who loved Gideon and was still saying it, that was different. She went back to the bunkhouse and lay awake longer than she wanted to. Dale stayed 4 days. He helped with fence work on the second day and was more useful at it than Mara had expected, which made her revise him slightly upward without quite resolving what she thought of him. He and Gideon talked in the evenings with the careful navigation of 2 men who had a long shared history of not quite saying the important things to each other, which Mara observed from a distance and recognized as a specific kind of love that had calcified over years into something that looked, from the outside, like disagreement. On the morning of his 3rd day, she heard them through the kitchen wall while she was getting coffee. She wasn't trying to listen, but the kitchen wall was thin and their voices were carrying. Not sustainable, Gid. The smokehouse is good. She's done good work, but that doesn't change the fundamentals. A pause. Gideon's voice lower, harder to make out. I know you don't want to sell. I'm not saying sell. I'm saying talk to someone. Get the actual numbers in front of you and look at them. Gideon again, a little louder now. She caught my numbers and know my own land. You always know your own land, Dale said, with the exhausted patience of a man who has said that sentence before. That's never been the question. She took her coffee and went to the smokehouse and closed the door. She worked hard that morning, harder than the task strictly required because the work was the one place where everything was in its right place, and she didn't have to think about the rest of it. She rechecked the 5th batch of bellies, adjusted 2 positions on the smoking rail, ran a temperature check on the firebox, and found it exactly right. She made notes in her grandmother's book. Not just the practical notes, but the kind that Bess used to call thinking on paper, the notes that weren't about measurements at all, but about what she was seeing and wondering. She wrote, "The smokehouse is one part of one thing. It's not the whole thing. I knew that coming in." She wrote, "The question I haven't asked myself is what I think the whole thing is worth." She crossed that last line out. Then she wrote it again. Dale left on a Friday morning. He said goodbye to the hands, clapped Tomas on the shoulder, embraced Rudy briefly in the way that suggested they'd known each other longer than this visit. He found Mara at the smokehouse and stopped in the doorway. "I hope I didn't offend you the other night," he said. He said it plainly, without much decoration, which made her believe he meant it. "You didn't," she said, which was mostly true. He nodded. "Gideon's lucky to have the provisions sorted." He paused. I mean that without the qualifications I put on it the other night. She looked at him. In the morning light, he looked less like a man managing a situation and more like a man who was tired of worrying about his brother and didn't know how to stop. He's going to be okay, she said. Dale looked at her for a moment. You believe that? She held his gaze. Yes. He studied her face like he was deciding whether she was the kind of person whose belief in something meant anything. Then he nodded, short and final, and put his hat on and walked to his truck. She watched him drive out and then went back to work. Chet. Gideon was quieter in the days after Dale left. Not morose. She'd seen enough of him by now to read the gradations of his silences. More like a man who had picked something up and was deciding where to put it down. He came to the smokehouse with coffee twice that week, without particular reason, sat with her the way he'd been sitting with her since the first freeze, and spoke less than usual, which was saying something. On the fourth day after Dale's departure, she was repositioning the sixth batch of shoulders on the rail when Gideon said, from his usual position against the south wall, "He told you about Briggs's offer." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. A pause. "What did you say?" "That it wasn't my business." She heard him exhale slowly, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent. "That's the right answer." "I know." She finished repositioning the cut and moved to the next one. "Is it something you're thinking about?" "I think about everything," he said. "I always have. It's mostly useless." He shifted slightly against the wall. "The offer isn't right, not because the price is wrong, because what comes after the price is wrong." She kept her hands on the work. "What do you mean?" "Briggs doesn't buy land the way other people buy land. He buys the operation and he restructures it, consolidates it into his existing setup. The people working here—" He stopped. Started again. "Rudy's been here 21 years, Cleat for 4, Tomas, the others. Briggs's model doesn't carry people over. He brings his own crew." He paused. "I won't do that to them." She stood still at the rail, not looking at him. She thought about Rudy carrying an extra blanket in the dark without saying anything about it. Tomas asking good questions at the smokehouse door. Cleat's sideways, grudging decency that had taken weeks to arrive and meant more for the cost of it. "Does Dale know that's why?" she asked. "Dale knows. And he still thinks you should sell." "Dale thinks I'm being sentimental," Gideon said. "He's not wrong. He's just measuring with the wrong tool." She turned around and looked at him. He was sitting with his arms on his knees, looking at the firebox, and he looked, for just that moment, like a man who was very tired and very committed to the same thing simultaneously, which she understood as one of the harder human conditions to sustain. "The ranch will be okay," she said. She'd said the same thing to Dale, but she meant it differently now. Gideon looked up at her. "Because of the smokehouse?" "The smokehouse is part of it." She held his gaze. "But that's not what I mean." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and then he looked back at the fire, and he said, "Okay." Just that one word. But the way he said it carried more weight than she'd expected it to. The sixth batch of provisions came out the following Saturday, and by the time Mara had finished her check and logged everything in the notebook, the total count was beyond anything she had planned for when she'd arrived in October. Every batch had run at or above her target yield. The curing had held through 2 hard freezes, through the disrupted wood supply, through the sabotaged vent and the bent latch, and everything Cleat had tried in those early weeks. The smokehouse that had smelled of giving up now held more winter provisions than Blackstone Ranch had put up in any single season in recent memory by Rudy's accounting. Rudy told her the number on a Sunday evening, matter-of-factly, reading from his own ledger that he'd been keeping parallel to hers. He set the ledger on the kitchen table and pointed at the column. She looked at the number. She looked at him. "That right?" she asked. "Checked it twice." He closed the ledger. "You know what this means for the spring?" She did. Winter provisions at this level meant the ranch came out of the cold season with its resources largely intact. No emergency stock depletion, no scrambling for feed, no borrowing against the next season to cover the shortfall of this one. It meant margin. And margin, on a struggling operation, was the difference between treading water and actually moving forward. "Does Gideon know the full count?" she asked. I showed him this morning. What did he say? Rudy was quiet for a moment. He said, tell her. A pause. That's what he said. Just tell her. She sat with that for a moment. Rudy, she said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When I first got here, that first week, before the first batch came out, did you think it was going to work? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing to an answer. I thought you knew what you were doing, he said finally. I wasn't sure the smokehouse would cooperate. He paused. I wasn't sure the men would cooperate. But you brought the juniper. You put it on the list. His expression shifted slightly, something warm underneath it. My wife used to say that if a person asks for exactly what they need and nothing else, you give it to them, because that kind of asking is rare. He stood up, picked up the ledger. She was almost always right. He went to his room. She sat at the table a while longer. She thought about her grandmother's notebook, which now had 63 new pages in her own handwriting added to Bess's 30 years of notes. She thought about what it felt like to add to something rather than just carry it. She thought about Gideon saying tell her. Not good work or thank you, but just tell her, like the information itself was the thing she was owed. Outside, the snow that had been threatening since Thursday finally started coming down. She could hear it more than see it. The way sound changes when the air fills with falling snow, quieter and closer at the same time, as if the world has drawn in around whatever is inside it. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the yard in the dark. The smokehouse was a gray shape against the white-going ground, its chimney pipe sending up a thin thread of smoke that disappeared quickly into the falling snow. The fire inside would hold until morning. She'd built it right before supper. She stood there for a while, watching the snow come down on the yard and the smokehouse and the fence lines and the low ridge to the north, and she felt, in a way she hadn't felt since her grandmother's property was sold out from under her and her particular kind of knowledge stopped having a home. She felt like something of hers was out there in that yard, in that building, in that smoke rising into the dark. Not ownership, something more complicated and less legal than that. She went to bed without naming it, because some things hold better when you leave them alone. Oh. The conversation that broke everything open happened on a Tuesday, and it started, as consequential conversations often do, without any sign that it was going to be one. She was at the kitchen table with her notebook, working through the timing on what she intended to be the final major batch of the season, when Gideon came in from outside with snow on his coat and the particular look of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has reached the place where thinking has stopped being useful. He poured coffee. He sat down. He looked at the table. I need to tell you something, he said. She closed the notebook. The wage I've been paying you, he said. 25 a week. He looked up. It's wrong. I accepted it. I know you did. He set his mug down. I offered it because I didn't know what you were worth, and I was trying to hold the little I had left together. And you took it because... He paused, like he was working out something he hadn't quite articulated before. I don't actually know why you took it. She looked at him. Because the work was here. He was quiet. That's it? That and the smokehouse key, she said. The key mattered. He looked at her for a long moment. I want to make it right, he said. The wage. I want to pay you what the work was actually worth, going back to the start. She shook her head. You can't afford that right now, and we both know it. Mara, I know what this ranch's finances look like, she said. Not the numbers exactly, but the shape of them. You put everything you had into making it through this winter. The margin we've built in the smokehouse changes next season, not this moment. She held his gaze. Don't make me a problem you have to solve right now. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not exactly frustration, more like the look of a man who has encountered an argument he can't honestly defeat and isn't sure whether to be grateful or irritated about it. You shouldn't have to be this reasonable, he said. I know, she said. It's not fair. I know that too. He looked at the table, at his hands. What do you want? He asked, and the question was direct in a way his questions rarely were, stripped of the usual buffer. She thought about it honestly. I want the work to mean what it means, she said. I want the smokehouse to keep running, next season and the one after. I want what I built in there to be something, not a single winter's fix that gets forgotten when spring comes." He was very still. "I want to know," she continued, more quietly now, "that I didn't spend 4 months in that building and sleeping on a cot through a -14 freeze for something that stops existing when the snow melts." The kitchen was very quiet. The snow was still coming down outside. The stove ticked. "It won't stop existing," he said. "How do I know that?" He looked at her directly. "Because I'm telling you." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Gideon, you're a man who trusts slowly and talks less than he should and makes decisions alone when he doesn't have to." She said it without accusation, just plainly, the way she'd been saying things to him since the first morning she'd handed back the smokehouse key argument about the vent. Telling me isn't the same as showing me. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. She didn't feel it. "No," he said at last. "It isn't." He stood up. He picked up his mug and stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the snow, and she could see him working at something. The same way he worked at physical things, deliberately, without rushing. Then he said, "Give me a few days," and walked out. She looked at the closed door, then she opened her notebook and picked up her pencil and looked at the blank page. And then she closed the notebook again because her mind wasn't on provisions. She sat at the kitchen table with the snow coming down outside and the stove ticking beside her and the ranch quiet around her. And she waited to find out what a few days meant to a man like Gideon Mercer when he'd finally decided to say something he meant. The few days Gideon had asked for turned into 3 and then 4. And Mara stopped counting because counting made it into something she was waiting for, and she'd decided she wasn't going to wait for anything she couldn't control. She worked. That was the answer to most things, in her experience, not because work solved the problem, but because it kept you from making the problem worse by turning it over in your hands too many times. She ran the final major batch of the season with the same attention she'd given the first one back in October, maybe more, because she understood now what this smokehouse meant to this place in a way she hadn't fully understood when she arrived. The 7th batch was the largest. 2 full days of prep work on the cure, longer hang time than any previous batch. A wood combination she'd been working toward since the 2nd week. Hickory and a small proportion of applewood she'd finally sourced from an orchard property 2 miles east that Pete Gallagher had mentioned during his visit. The applewood did exactly what she'd told Rudy it would do back when he'd questioned it. It rounded the edge of the hickory, gave the finished product a particular depth that was different from anything the previous batches had produced. Rudy tasted the first test piece on a Wednesday morning and said nothing for a long time. "Well?" she asked. "My wife would have driven 40 miles for this," he said. He set the piece down with the careful reverence of a man handling something that deserves it. She wrote the wood ratio in the notebook and moved on. On the 5th day after Gideon had said, "Give me a few days," she came back from the smokehouse at dusk to find him sitting on the porch steps with a folded piece of paper in his hands. He didn't look up immediately when she came across the yard. She slowed her pace slightly, reading the set of his shoulders, and understood that whatever was on that paper was the thing he'd spent 5 days building toward. She stopped at the base of the steps. He looked up. "Sit down," he said. She sat down on the step beside him, not close, but not far either, the way they'd learned to occupy shared space. He held the paper for another moment without opening it, looking at the yard. "I had Rudy pull the ranch's full financial records," he said. "Everything, the operating costs, the debt service, the projected income for next season based on the herd count and the current beef prices." He paused. "I asked Pete Gallagher to look at them too, because Pete's a fair man and he knows numbers better than I do, and I trust him not to tell me what I want to hear." She waited. "The smokehouse changes things," he said. "Not everything, but enough." He opened the paper, looked at it. "The provision savings alone, projected forward, recover about 30% of the operating shortfall we've been running. Combined with what Pete thinks we can do with a targeted herd expansion in spring, if we start the planning now, the operation is viable." He stopped on that word. Viable. Not comfortable. Not easy. Viable. She looked at the paper in his hands without trying to read it. "Okay," she said, "but the smokehouse only holds if it keeps running the way you've been running it." He turned his head and looked at her directly. I can teach what I understand. I can't teach what I don't. And what you do in that building, Mara, I don't understand it the way you do. Nobody on this property does. She held his gaze. You're telling me you need me to stay. I'm telling you the ranch needs you to stay. He folded the paper, looked at it. Those are different things, and I'm trying to be honest about which one I'm saying. She looked at the yard. The snow from earlier in the week had compacted into a hard crust on the ground, glittering slightly in the last of the cold evening light. The smokehouse sat back from them, its chimney putting out its steady thread of smoke, patient and indifferent to whatever conversation was happening 30 feet away. What are you proposing? She asked. He held the folded paper out to her. She took it and opened it. It was not a formal document. It was handwritten on plain paper in Gideon's careful, slightly cramped script, the handwriting of a man who doesn't write often and takes it seriously when he does. She read it slowly. What he was proposing was not wages. He was proposing a formal operating partnership, her name alongside his on the ranch's business structure, a defined share of the annual operating profit beginning with the following season, and specific authority over the food preservation and provisions operation as a permanent function of the ranch rather than a seasonal hire. He'd worked out the percentage with Pete Gallagher, he'd noted at the bottom, and Pete thought it was fair to both sides. She read it twice. She read the bottom line a third time. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and looked at the smokehouse. You talked to Pete about this, she said. Yes. Before you talked to me. I needed someone to tell me if the numbers worked. I already knew what I wanted to say. She turned that over. How long have you known what you wanted to say? He was quiet for a moment. Since about the third week of October, he said. When you came out of the smokehouse at 6 a.m. after your first overnight batch, and you ate your breakfast standing up because you were going to go straight back in, and you didn't make anything of it. He paused. I knew then that you weren't here the way most people are anywhere. You were here the way people are when something is actually theirs. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not painfully, more the way things tighten when they've been held loose for too long and finally find their shape. She looked down at the folded paper in her hands. Gideon, she said carefully, I need to say something and I need you to actually hear it. All right. I'm not easy to work with. You know that by now, but I want to say it directly. I have opinions about everything and I don't surrender them gracefully, and I will argue with you about things that are mine to decide until one of us gives up, and it won't be me. She looked at him. I came here alone. I made decisions alone. I solved problems alone because that's how I know to do things. Doing them with someone else, as a partner, with equal say on both sides, I haven't done that. I don't know how I am at it. He met her eyes without flinching. You think I'm easy to work with? She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close again, closer than the last time. No, she said. I've made every decision about this ranch alone for 11 years, he said. I'm not proposing that because I've suddenly figured out how to share authority. I'm proposing it because I've watched you for 5 months, and I think two people who both know how to be right about things can work out how to be right about things together, if they're honest enough. He paused. I could be wrong about that. You could be. So could you. She looked back at the smokehouse. The smoke was rising steady and straight in the still cold air. No wind to push it sideways, just that clean vertical line going up into the darkening sky. She thought about her grandmother's notebook, now thick with her own pages. She thought about what it meant to add to something rather than just carry it, and then to have the thing you'd added to become something you stayed with rather than moved on from. She thought about the difference between belonging somewhere because you'd made yourself fit and belonging somewhere because the place had made room for you on your own terms. She thought about minus 14 degrees and a cup of coffee in the dark. She looked at Gideon. I want it in writing, she said. Not like this. She held up the folded paper. I mean, a proper document, something that means what it says and has both our names on it in a form that holds up. Pete knows a lawyer in Carver's Crossing, Gideon said immediately, as though he'd already thought about this, which she suspected he had. She does ranch and property work. Fair, not cheap. That's fine. We'd go in the new year. Give the lawyer time to draft it right. That's fine, too. He looked at her steadily for one more moment. Then he extended his right hand. She looked at it. She took it. They shook once, firm and brief, the handshake of two people who are not performing anything for anyone, just marking a moment between them that they'll both remember clearly and differently for the rest of their lives. She handed him back the paper. "Keep it," he said. She kept it. Teat. That night she sat on her bunkhouse cot with the folded paper on the blanket beside her and her grandmother's notebook open on her knee, and she wrote on the next blank page, not provisions data, not temperature logs, not wood ratios. She wrote, October to December, 7 batches, 1 smokehouse. She paused, then added, 1 ranch that was worth staying for. She looked at that last line for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and lay back and listened to the wind come down off the northern ridge, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the paperwork version of it, not the practical version, but the actual human version, the one where a woman who had been untethered since February had put her hands on something solid and it had held. She was 31 years in her grandmother's notebook. She was on page 67 of her own. She slept better than she had since October. Dale Mercer called the ranch the following Saturday. She happened to be in the kitchen when Gideon took the call, and she didn't try to leave because she didn't think she needed to, and she'd stopped conducting herself around this ranch as though she were a guest. She heard Gideon's side of it, short, factual, the way he talked when he was telling someone something he'd already decided and wasn't inviting discussion. I worked out an arrangement with Mara, partnership. We're seeing a lawyer in January. A pause, then, I know you think that. Another pause, longer. Then, Dale, I know you think that, but you're not here, and I am, and I know what this ranch needs. He was quiet for a moment. You can come see it in the spring and tell me I was wrong if I was. He hung up and turned and saw her at the table and didn't say anything, just poured himself coffee and sat down. He thinks it's a mistake, she said. He thinks a lot of things are mistakes that aren't. Gideon wrapped both hands around his mug. He also thought I was making a mistake when I didn't sell 4 years ago. Ranch is still here. She looked at him. He loves you. I know he does. A pause. That doesn't make him right. She nodded slowly. She thought that was probably the most important thing Gideon Mercer had ever said to her. Not because it was about Dale, but because it was about the difference between love and judgment, and how those two things get confused with each other constantly by people who mean well, and how knowing the difference was one of the things that determined whether a person lived their own life or a version of it that someone else decided was safer. She picked up her coffee. What did your father do with this ranch? She asked. She'd never asked before. She wasn't entirely sure why she was asking now. Gideon looked at the table. Cattle, same as me. Not well enough, mostly. He was better with animals than with numbers, and he knew it, and he spent 20 years being angry about it. He turned the mug. He didn't like asking for help. Thought it was the same as failing. You're better at it than he was. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. What makes you say that? You handed me the smokehouse key 20 minutes after you met me, she said. That's not a man who can't ask for help. That's a man who recognizes it when it's standing in his yard. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not softness exactly, more the specific expression of a person hearing something true about themselves that they hadn't found the words for. Don't give me too much credit, he said. I was desperate. Desperation and wisdom aren't mutually exclusive, she said. You were both. He looked back at his coffee. She let the silence sit, because she'd learned his silences by now the way you learn the silences of a place you've lived in long enough. Not just their presence, but their quality, what they contained. This one contained something he was trying to figure out whether to say. She waited. My father would have hated everything about this arrangement, he said finally. Woman on the deed, someone he didn't know, hadn't known for years. Partnership instead of hire. He paused. He would have said it was giving away something that was earned by blood. And what do you say? He was quiet for a moment. I say the ranch is still here because of what you did in that smokehouse. And what you did in that smokehouse was earned the same way anything worth earning is earned. He looked up. With your hands and your head and your time and your grandmother's 30 years of notes. He paused.
That's not nothing. That's not less than blood. It's just different. She held that for a moment. You're going to make a decent partner, she said. I'm going to be a difficult one, he said. I know. She stood up, picked up her cup. So am I. Nut.
Harlan Briggs made one final attempt. She hadn't expected it, which maybe she should have. It came in the form of a visit, unannounced, the last Thursday of November, when Mara was in the smokehouse finishing the final check on the 7th batch, and Gideon was out on the north pasture with Cleat doing fence repair before the next predicted snow. She heard the truck pull in and looked out the smokehouse vent gap and saw a vehicle she didn't know. Expensive, dark blue, too clean for working ranch roads, which told her everything. She watched the driver get out. Heavy-set, 60s, the unhurried movement of a man who expects the world to wait. She opened the smokehouse door and walked into the yard. Briggs saw her and stopped. He looked at the smokehouse behind her. He looked at her. He was doing the math. Smoke, canvas apron, no Gideon in sight. And deciding something. Gideon around? He asked. He's on the north pasture, she said. Back in an hour, probably. He nodded, slow. You're the one running the smokehouse. Yes. He looked at the building behind her again with the particular attention of a man who has an operation of his own and is assessing a competitor. I heard it's been a good season. It has, she said. He looked at her with the frank assessment she'd seen from Dale and from Pete Gallagher and from a dozen other men over the past months, but with a quality under it that was different from all of them. Something cooler, more calculating. The look of a man who is deciding what something is worth to him rather than what it is. Must have taken some work, he said, to get that building running right. It took the right person, she said, and enough time. He almost smiled. You plan on staying? She looked at him. I'm a partner here as of the new year, so yes. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically. A man like Briggs didn't let his reactions run loose, but enough. The calculation behind his eyes adjusted. Gideon agreed to that. We agreed to it together. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the smokehouse. That building put up good numbers this season. Better than anything this ranch has seen in years, she said. She said it without heat, just plainly. And next season it'll be running from the start, with the improvements already in place and the wood supply already organized and the methods already dialed in. She paused. The season after that will be better still. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and waited, and she understood that what was happening in this conversation was the final version of the same conversation that had been happening since she arrived, the one about whether she knew what she was doing and whether what she'd built was real, and whether this ranch and this smokehouse and this particular woman were a temporary arrangement or something with actual permanence to it. She'd answered the question every time with the work. She answered it now with the same thing, just in different form. Tell Gideon I stopped by, Briggs said finally. I will. He walked back to his truck. He didn't look back at the smokehouse. She stood in the yard and watched him drive out and disappear down the ranch road, and she thought that some arguments didn't end with a resolution, just with one side of them running out of traction. She went back into the smokehouse and checked the fire. Gideon came back from the north pasture at 4. She told him about Briggs while she was washing the prep tools at the outside basin, and he was leaning against the fence rail nearby, listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What did he say when you told him you were a partner? He asked. He stopped asking when you'd be back. Gideon looked at the middle distance. Then something moved across his face that was, she was almost sure, the closest thing to satisfaction she'd seen on him. It was brief, and he didn't make anything of it, but it was there. Good, he said. She turned back to the basin. Mara. She looked over her shoulder. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated look she'd come to understand as his most honest one. The one without any management in it, no buffer between what he meant and what he said. I want you to know something, he said, not because it changes the paperwork or the arrangement, just because it's true and you should have heard it earlier. She waited. When you walked into this yard in October with a bag over your shoulder and stood there looking at the smokehouse like it owed you something, I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought this was going to be one more thing that didn't work out. One more person who said they could do something and couldn't. I'd had enough of those. He paused. I gave you the key because I had nothing left to protect by keeping it, not because I believed you, but—" She held his gaze. "I believed you by the third morning," he said, "when you came out of the smokehouse at dawn and you were covered in ash and you looked like you'd been awake all night and you just said, 'The draft is working,' and went to get coffee." A pause. "Like it was obvious, like you'd never doubted it." She thought about that morning. She'd doubted it. She'd sat beside that fire for 4 hours, not sure if the vent adjustment was going to do what she needed it to do. She just hadn't said so. "I doubted it," she said. "I know that now," he said. "Then I didn't. Then it looked like certainty, and I thought, this is someone who knows something I don't. And I hadn't thought that about another person in a very long time." She looked at the basin, at the water going cold on her hands, at the tools she'd washed clean. She thought about what it cost a man like Gideon to say something like that. Not just the words, but the willingness to be seen in the saying of them. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her once that the hardest thing to do was let someone see where your knowledge ended, because that was the same place where you needed them. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." He nodded once, pushed off the fence rail, and went toward the house. She stood at the basin in the cold afternoon and let the water go, and let the moment be what it was. The final batch of the season came out on a December morning when the snow was coming down steady and had been since the night before. The valley was white in every direction, the ridge to the north invisible behind low cloud, the ranch road indistinguishable from the surrounding field except for the fence lines on either side. Mara pulled the last of the 7th batch and set it on the prep table and called Rudy. He came in and looked at the full layout. Every cut from the final batch arranged across the table, the color and surface texture she'd been building toward all season, the particular quality that came from 7 iterations of refinement on top of 30 years of her grandmother's knowledge. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Bess would have been proud." She looked at him. "You didn't know my grandmother." "I know what I'm looking at," he said simply. She looked back at the table. She thought about Bess, not as a memory she was mourning, but as a presence she was carrying, which felt different. The notebook on the shelf behind her had 63 new pages in Mara's handwriting. It was heavier than it had been in October, literally and otherwise. "Let me get Gideon," Rudy said, and left before she could say anything. He came back with Gideon and Tomas and, to her surprise, Cleat, who stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands again and looked at the prep table with the expression of a man who has spent a season being wrong about something and has finally made peace with the cost of it. They all stood around the table in the smokehouse, the 7 of them counting Rudy, and nobody said anything for a moment that stretched out long enough to be intentional. Then Tomas said, "That's the whole winter right there." "And then some," Rudy said. Gideon looked at the table and then at Mara. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She understood what his face was doing by now. The contained, deliberate expression that was his version of something large. Cleat cleared his throat. He looked at the prep table. He looked at his hat. He said, "Best smokehouse in the valley," with the specificity of a man choosing each word individually, and then he put his hat on and walked out. Tomas watched him go, looked at Mara. "That's basically a speech for Cleat." "I know," she said. She did know. She knew what it cost, and she received it as what it was. The lawyer in Carver's Crossing was a woman named Frances Aldred, mid-50s, brisk, and careful, and exactly the kind of person you wanted handling paperwork that mattered. She'd done ranch law for 20 years, and she asked good questions, and she didn't assume she understood the arrangement before she'd heard it described by both parties. They went in on a Tuesday in the first week of January. Mara and Gideon sat across the desk from Frances Aldred and answered her questions one at a time, and when Frances asked each of them separately what they understood the arrangement to mean and what they expected from it, they gave answers that were different in their specifics but aligned in their fundamentals, which Frances noted as a good sign. The document took 3 weeks to draft and revise. They signed it on a Thursday afternoon in Frances Aldred's office, Gideon with his careful, cramped handwriting and Mara with her own, and Frances witnessed it and handed them each a copy in a plain manila envelope. They drove back to the ranch mostly in silence, the way they drove most places. The valley was deep in winter now, the snow permanent on every surface, the mountains to the north white from base to peak. The ranch road felt different under the truck's tires than it had in October. Or maybe she was the one who felt different under it. She carried the envelope inside and put it on the shelf in the smokehouse, next to her grandmother's notebook. She thought that was the right place for it. Stem. There is a thing that happens when someone spends their life carrying knowledge that the world around them doesn't know how to value. The knowledge is real. It works. It solves real problems in real conditions. But without a place to put it, it exists in a kind of suspension, present and useless at the same time, like water in a drought that no one has built a pipe to carry. Mara Ellison had spent 2 years after her grandmother's death in that suspension. She'd moved through that time not quite lost, because she knew what she knew, but without the place that gave the knowing somewhere to go. What Blackstone Ranch gave her was not just the place. Any place could have taken her skills and used them for a season and let her go. What Blackstone gave her was the insistence of it, the way the work mattered there in a way that accrued, that built, that left something permanent in the form of cured provisions and rebuilt rails and a restored smokehouse and a notebook getting heavier and a name on a document that said, "This belongs to her too." That kind of belonging is earned differently than people think. It's not about time, though time is part of it. It's not about being liked, though that matters some. It's about doing the thing that needs doing, in the place where it needs doing, at the temperature and the hour it requires, without waiting for the world to notice or to ask or to give you permission to call it yours. She had done that. She was doing it still. The smokehouse ran all that winter and into the spring, and when spring came, Mara did go to Margaret Forsyth's operation, as she'd promised, and spent 3 days going through the sheep ranch's preservation process and found 2 things that had been wrong for years, both of them fixable with changes that cost almost nothing. Margaret Forsyth listened to every word and asked sharp questions and implemented the changes the following week without waiting to think about it twice. She was that kind of person. Mara liked her more for it. Pete Gallagher came by in April with a man he wanted her to meet, a younger rancher from the next valley over who had a smokehouse he'd built himself and couldn't figure out why it wasn't working right. She spent an afternoon with him going through the draft issues, the wood selection, the curing ratios. He took notes. She sent him home with a page from the notebook, not an original page, a copy she'd made, with the temperature and timing information he needed. She didn't charge him. She thought about what her grandmother would have done, and that was the answer. The herd expansion Gideon had planned with Pete's help went in that spring. Careful, not rushed. The right number of animals for the land's actual capacity rather than the capacity they wanted it to have. Cleat ran the expanded herd work with a steadiness that surprised no one who had been paying attention to him since December. Tomas turned out to have a natural instinct for the calving operation that kept him busy and content through the wet spring months. Rudy, who had been talking about retiring for 2 years before Mara arrived, did not retire. He showed no signs of retiring. He did, however, start teaching Tomas to cook, which was its own form of legacy building, though he would not have used those words. Gideon and Mara disagreed about 14 separate things between January and June by her rough count. They resolved 12 of them. 2 of them were still unresolved in July, sitting in the particular productive tension of arguments that are actually about the right things and therefore don't have easy answers. She thought that was probably healthy. She thought that was probably exactly right. In July, on a warm evening when the valley was green in every direction and the mountains to the north had just started to show the first faint suggestion of snow on their high peaks that meant the season was already thinking about turning again, Mara sat on the porch steps of the ranch house with her grandmother's notebook open on her knee. She was on page 91. Gideon came out and sat down beside her. Not close, not far, the specific distance that was theirs, with 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one without asking. She took it. He looked out at the yard, at the smokehouse sitting back from the fence line with its door standing open in the summer warmth. It didn't look like the same building she'd arrived at in October. It wasn't the same building. She'd made it into something different, and then the something different had made her into something different in return, which was how it went when a thing was actually working. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Notes for the fall batch," she said. "There's a change I want to make to the brine timing for the shoulders. I've been thinking about it since the 7th batch." He looked at the notebook, at her handwriting filling the page. "You've added a lot to that book." 65 pages, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother would have approved of the juniper, he said. She looked at him. She came around to it eventually. Smart woman. Yes, she said. She was. She looked back at the notebook and then out at the yard, at the smokehouse, at the long summer light on the valley and the fence lines and the green hills going brown at their edges where the heat had been sitting. She thought about October. She thought about a padlocked door and a key on a rusted ring and a man who handed it to her because he had nothing left to protect. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with a bag and a notebook and a grandmother's knowledge and a stubbornness that had never once looked like a virtue to anyone who encountered it before it became one. She thought, some things are only obvious in retrospect, and that's all right, because obvious in retrospect is still obvious. She picked up her pencil and wrote the brine adjustment in the notebook and underlined it twice and drew a small arrow to the margin note that explained the reasoning, the way Bess always had, so that someone reading it later would understand not just what to do, but why. The evening settled over the valley. The coffee was good. The smokehouse stood open in the warm air, patient and permanent, waiting for fall. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, in the place that had become hers, not because it was handed to her, but because she had earned it. The only way anything is ever truly earned. With her hands and her time and her grandmother's 30 years and her own 65 pages and a fire she'd kept burning through the coldest night of the year, alone in the dark, because the work required it, and so she did. That was the whole story.